Welcome back, family. We are here. My name is Jeremy Anato-Mensah, and this is my co-host,
Eric Igwe.
We're back again here with a shot of E&J. So now we want to get into the conversation about redistricting and what that really means, right? So Eric is going to give you a brief introduction into that, and then we're going to continue with our discussion.
Yeah. So first off, what the heck is redistricting? So that's, going to go into that. So last year during the pandemic, there was a lot of focus on U.S. Census count, right? So there's a push from the federal government or push from through your local government to go fill out the census, fill out a survey so we can do a count and see how many people in your household. They want to use this data. And then from there, they collect the census data, and they've been pushing delays, but they finally collect the census data. And then it's supposed to go to the president. I think it was by December 31st of last year. But then due to COVID, there's been some delays. But they're collecting all the census data so they can determine what's the new population trends? What has changed? Because census is done every 10 years. You did one in 2010, you have to do one in 2020, understand what the new trends, understand the population growth and changes. And then once you had all information, that allows states to say, you know what? Then that allows the federal government to determine how many congressional districts, or how many representatives you have. Because right now you have 435 representatives, right, in the House, 100 U.S. senators in the Senate. No matter what, in each state, you have 2 senators per state. But when it comes to House of Representatives, it's based on a portion. It's based on size of the population. States with larger size will have more, representatives. And so now with the census data, it does an opportunity to do a refocus, a realignment of, all right, now with the new census data, what happens now? So with this new census data, you find out that Texas can gain 2 more congressional seats, right? You have other states losing a congressional seat. And so once you have all the census data together, all the states are required every 10 years to do what they call redistricting. This is an opportunity for states, not just states, but going down from a local level all the way to state level to really have an opportunity to redraw maps, to go and shape the maps of the local areas based on the new citizens data information. And like I said, redistricting is not just done at the state level. Everyone want to focus on redistricting done in Congress. It's done at your local level in city council. It is done at the county commissioner level. It is done at state board of education level. It is done at state house, state senate level. It is done at, like I said, congressional level. So this has a huge impact saying, based on new census data, I have to do what we call redistricting, which is a process, like I said, of creating new maps, drawing new maps based on the new data. And to determine to make sure we have the proper representation and to reflect the new allocations that you're going to get as far as representation. So that's what we'll say redistricting. And I know you have some case law that you want to provide that kind of provides context to redistricting.
Yeah, so I think it's important to note that, since the 60s, probably even before the 60s, there was a lot of challenges that were going on statewide and obviously federally, where you had certain litigants wanted the redistricting process to take place within certain parameters, and they felt as though it wasn't happening fairly. So Baker v. Carr's 1962 Supreme Court case was basically says that the Supreme Court has the jurisdiction in order to rule on cases dealing with redistricting and, how states come up with their redistricting plans and maps and so on and so forth. So that basically gave them jurisdiction to rule on these type of cases. And then from there, the jurisprudence or the legal doctrine kind of moves into, this one vote, what was it, one person, one vote doctrine, kind of where if you have redistricting that is not taking place in a certain amount of time, or it's taking place in a manner which is unfavorable to certain groups, that is per se unconstitutional, right? Because we have an equal protection doctrine, and you're basically going to be denying certain people the right to vote or to have their vote count, so that they can have representatives which elect them. So, and there's a lot of other cases that go into a lot of specific details about, how states can actually do the redistricting and all that kind of stuff. But those are two seminal cases that sort of started this wave. And then now I think you were going to discuss with us about Shelby v. Holder, right?
So we're going to go into Shelby v. Holder. I'm going to go briefly, but why redistricting is important too is, and this is how we talk about affecting people of color too, because part of its history is there's been a lot of fights. You have in 1965, it was passed the Voting Rights Act, right, to protect people, especially citizens, regardless of color, and regardless of color, regardless of gender, and making sure they have equal access to voting rights, right? And so that was a huge milestone in 1965, and because there's been years and decades and centuries of African Americans, and especially African Americans and other minorities, getting affected through voting. Get impacted through voting because of voter suppression, because of doing poll tags and literacy tests, facing all kind of suppressions, finding any steps to prevent
voter ID.
Yeah, finding any steps to prevent, black folks or people of color from voting. And so the 1965 Voting Rights Act was a huge step. But now Shelby versus Holder in 2013 essentially struck down Section 4, which is a formula that was created to say, if states have a history of these suppression, right, have a history of committing certain violations and have exhibited those behaviors over a long period of time or over a certain duration of time, the Department of Justice is allowed to intervene and certain changes to voting maps or maps or any voting behavior, voting laws have to be reviewed, what we call pre-clearance, but reviewed through the DOJ before it gets approved. But the formula got struck down in Section 4 of how do you determine which states are who has to be subject to pre-clearance. So Section 4 formula got struck down, would make Section 5, which is the pre-clearance, null and void. I mean, ineffective.
Effectively.
Yeah. And so now with that struck down, you have some of these elected officials who feel like they have free reign to impose restrictions and make voting a little harder or create, and which makes redistricting even more important because, it creates the important awareness to say, hey, I need to see how these maps are going to get drawn because it's going to be really harder for me to vote. And then I got to see what steps the elected official is going to do to carve out maps that may be unfavorable to certain communities or certain people of interest. And that kind of leads into what we talking about gerrymandering. What is gerrymandering? I mean, because what happens with redistricting, when the redistricting process happens, then you have people accused of gerrymandering, essentially creating maps for the purpose of favoring them or favoring their beliefs or favoring to favor their political motives. So people were, you got people worried about that because they don't want, for example, one party coming in and saying, you know what, I'm going to create all these maps based on what's going to help me win elections as a party. That's a form of gerrymandering itself, just carving the stuff and creating maps just to really favor one person or one group. And so those are some of those concerns about that. And then I know when Jeremy, we can go talk about one of those major cases when we're talking about gerrymandering, Rucho versus Common Cause in 2019. Now people are like, what is that case? Why should I care? Well, that case is support for gerrymandering because in a 5-4 vote in the Supreme Court says that gerrymandering is pretty much a political question and essentially beyond the reach of federal courts. So people look at that as it gives essentially legislators free reign to go and create maps and create new maps based on gerrymandering based on their partisan views. And so people were fearful that, like I said, if you're not getting involved once again or taking efforts to be aware and fight for favorable maps or maps that's going to be that's not going to be prejudiced against our people of color or people who've been traditionally affected, then it's gonna it can have adverse effect across communities. So, I mean, like I said, I don't know, what's your thoughts about it?
So I think it's kind of important to understand what the Supreme Court is saying too with the Rucho v. Common Cause case. So essentially, in a 5-4 decision, they punted the question, and I say they punted it because they didn't really even address whether or not extreme gerrymandering is unconstitutional, right? And they justified their decision via the political question doctrine, which is what you mentioned. The important thing to note too is that this is a 5-4 decision that was, split directly along party lines. So in other words, you had 4 Democrats or Democrat-leaning justices who were
they're supposed to be impartial, man.
Right. And then 5 conservatives essentially or conservative-leaning who were okay with it, right? The political question doctrine essentially has 2 parts to it, and I'll get to why I'm going into this, why it's relevant. So on one end, they say it's a political question because the Constitution has already spoken and said that there is another branch of government that is supposed to deal with this issue. So be it the legislator or be it the executive branch. Therefore, the judiciary, if I can say that, the judicial branch, right, is not to be involved in it. So therefore, it's a political question.
They take a bailout.
Right. The other end is where they're saying, you know what, this is what they'll say is a non-justiciable, if I can say that word, issue, right?
I'm gonna let you have that one.
Right. And essentially, this is not even discussed within the context of the Constitution. So we have no business whatsoever even, saying anything about it or speaking on it on behalf of the court, because there's no legal principles here for us to use to really analyze this case, right? And so that is what your Supreme Court is saying. That's what they're saying, that, and in ways it's kind of a hybrid approach. They're saying that, this is really a state's issue, right? States can determine this. And there's really nothing directly that the framers have spoken to as far as, whether or not we think redistricting is something that, should be handled by the judiciary or
in regards to partisan gerrymandering.
Right.
Yeah.
Extreme gerrymandering.
Yeah.
Partisan
because
gerrymandering.
if you're in it, if you persecute, if you create maps to adversely
affect
people of color, and it's evident, then
that's exactly where I'm going with that. Exactly. So that's where I think we got to realize as people that this was a totally partisan, biased opinion coming down from the Supreme Court in a way to basically allow states, conservative states in particular, to continue to impose redistricting plans that disenfranchise minority voters, black voters, poor white voters, Hispanic voters, whatever is the category that you're considering, because they clearly know that these redistricting plans, right, there's clear evidence out there, are being used to disenfranchise the voters, which goes back to violations of equal protection and all those other things, the constitutional rights that you have to vote. And so how then can they say that this is not within the purview of the Constitution for us to rule on it? It just seems, it's just real obtuse thinking, It's like you don't want to deal with the issue. You want states to have the right to be able to disenfranchise. So you punt the issue and you say, well, see, we can't deal with that. That's not, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, in regards to partisan gerrymandering. Yep.
So I mean, really, I think that it really shows where we are as a country in terms of, the Supreme Court and how it really matters. And I know you have your own analysis on this, but it really matters who's on the bench. It matters who the justices are. And, some would say it is an indication that perhaps the courts should be packed a little bit more. They should start thinking about adding a justice.
You trying to flip the system, man.
Yeah. Maybe that. I mean, who was it? Was it FDR who considered it? I can't remember what president considered it. If it was FDR, but there was a time where a particular president did not like what was coming from the Supreme Court, the jurisprudence, and he certainly threw that out as an idea, and it sort of it rustled some feathers, but it got a little bit of the attention of the opposing party. What are your thoughts on this?
No. I mean, I think Supreme Court justices have a lot of power. I mean, sorry. Yes, they do. And I think, but it is a lot of steps to, change the court. I mean, you can add more people.
Oh, of course.
You can add more justice, but President Biden's not going to make that happen. That's one. And then two, some of the Democrats are pushing for it, but they don't have enough votes to really make it happen. They're not really. I don't know if some
they're not really behind it.
I don't know if someone really about that life. So I'm just going to say, it's going to take a lot of work to pull that off, but it's really going to be pressing more on making sure you got proper representation at congressional level, at the state legislature and the Congress, to really, fight for laws that's going to really be fair and equitable and protect people's voting right act, regardless of race and color. So that's going to be really some of the more immediate push, because waiting for Supreme Court justice to say they want to retire, or wait for them to die, and hoping that, oh my gosh, we have the right president who's going to make the right picks. I mean, it's hard. Right. That's all I'm saying. But I want to get quite. I mean, before we even get to break, we want to go to the talk about like some of the redistricting timelines. So normally, like I mentioned, you get the census data. They were supposed to come by April. April. Like, we live in Texas, supposed to come to the state legislature by April, because we know Texas state legislature runs from like January all the way into May. And so it came around like the first data for a portion, it came around like towards mid-April or end of April. But you can't even use that to go start the redistricting. So the data didn't really come until August. And so it missed the first session. And now Texas, for example, in Texas we live, redistricting efforts are starting. We have a third special session that kicked off on September 20th that kicks off talking about redistricting. And so there is redistricting efforts going on across the nation in some form or fashion, where like they finally they got the census data that's broken down to a lower level to allows them to add into a software to then start creating maps. So that's why you're seeing a lot of movement recently over the past month to start creating maps across nationwide, is because they finally got that census data in August that really broke it down to a lower level that allowed them to then process it, format it in a lot of cases into a software that allows them to load in the new population data at those levels, so they can go off and create new maps. So but when we get back from break, we're going to go and deep dive into more about redistricting. What does it mean for Black folks? Talk about, are we for an independent redistricting commission? I mean, what does that mean? Should we leave it in the hands of politicians? So we're going to talk about some of that when we get back on a Shot of E&J podcast.